Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Eugenia Bertone. She's going to welcome us.
Bona tarda, bon dia.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to the presentation act of the
Amistad i PUGNA
Democracy,
de la
Friendship,
doctora
and Struggle of
Jane
Dr.
Mansbridge,
Jane
que tenim l'honor
Mansbridge,
d'acollir
and
al
we
Col·legi
have
de
the honor
Professionals
to
de la
have her
Ciència
here
Política i
in
la
the
Sociologia
Professional
de
Association of
Catalunya,
Political Scientists and
impulsat per les
Sociologists of
comissions acadèmiques de
Barcelona,
gènere,
together
gràcies a la
with the
col·laboració de
gender,
l'editor, el doctor
and
Felipe Rey, i
thanks
a
to Felipe
l'Editorial
Rey,
Gedisa.
and thanks to the
En el
Editorial
col·loqui sobre
Gedisa.
l'obra ens acompanyaran
Today we're
l'autora
going
i
to
l'editor
have
del llibre,
here her
així
editor,
com dues honorables conselleres del govern de Catalunya,
together
el
with
degà del
two
Col·legi de
councillors of
Ciència
the
Política i
government of
Sociologia
Catalonia,
i una
the,
representant del Consell Nacional de Dones de Catalunya
the Dean
i
of the
alguns
Professional
d'universitats
Association,
catalanes.
and different members
Sense
of
més
Catalan
preàmbul,
associations. So
passo de nou la
without further
paraula
ado,
a
I will
Lídia, que
give back
qui
the
serà
word to
qui conduirà
Lydia,
l'acte d'aquesta
who
tarda.
will drive the act
Gràcies.
today. Thank you.
Moltes gràcies, Eugènia.
Thank you very much,
I
Eugenia.
ara passo
And
a donar
now
la
I
paraula
will give
al
the
doctor
floor
Jordi
to the
Pacheco,
Dr.
degà
Jordi
del
Pacheco,
Col·legi de
who is
Professionals
the
de
Dean
Ciència
of
Política
the
i
Professional Association of
Sociologia
Political
de
Scientists and
Catalunya,
Sociologists
en el
of
que,
Catalonia.
com a responsable de comissió acadèmica, i amb l'Eugènia
And
de gènere,
together
és un
with
plaer
Eugenia,
poder
it's a
estar avui
pleasure
aquí
to have
presentant
them here today and to
aquest
present
important llibre en
this
l'esfera
important
política
book in the
catalana, ciència
political
política.
sphere in Catalonia.
Moltes gràcies, Lídia.
Thank you,
La
Lydia.
veritat és que és un honor tenir a la
It's a
professora
pleasure
Mansbridge,
to have
que
Dr.
jo
Mansbridge
personalment
here today.
considero que és la principal
Personally, I
referent
believe
de
she's
la
the main
teòric,
reference
no?
of
I
the
l'estudi de la política
theoretical
deliberativa
political part
en aquests
here
principis, aquesta primera
in
tram
this
del segle XXI. I, de
22nd
fet, tots
century.
els que ens hem dedicat la vida
And for
professional
those
i
of us who
acadèmica
have dedicated our
a les
professional and
deliberacions
academical
públiques,
life to
doncs hem hagut de
political
recórrer
deliberations, we
contínuament als
have had
conceptes que
to go
ha
back
treballat
to the
la
concepts that she has
professora
worked
Mansbridge.
with.
I és que hi ha una qüestió, un problema, que és que
And there is a
participació és
main problem.
una paraula polisèmica que vol dir moltes
Participation
coses,
is a
i
word that
si no es tenen
means
els
a lot
conceptes
of
clars,
things, and
doncs
we
la
need
gent
to
es
have the
perd,
concept
i
clear.
és molt important
Otherwise, people
recórrer
get lost.
a aquest tipus
And it's
de
important to
conceptes,
go
no?
back to
Distingir quan estem al marc
understanding
d'una
these concepts
democràcia
and to
assembleària o de quan
understand
estem
when
al
we
marc
are
d'una
in an
institució
assemblearic
representativa,
democracy or in
perquè a vegades
in
confonen les
an
coses, i és
association that is
quan es
representative.
genera
We need to
cert
have
descontentament.
all of these concepts clear to
La
avoid people
democràcia representativa, en què consisteix aquesta
being
representació?
discontent.
Que també
What does
no
this
és un concepte
representation
recurrent,
refer
és fàcil
to?
d'entendre,
It's a
però
concept that
després
we all
vol dir
use,
moltes coses,
but it
i
means
per
a
tant
lot of things.
aquestes idees de
And
representació
so we need
gyroscòpica,
to take into account all of
que la
these
professora
ideas
Mansbridge
in
són
mind, and all of
molt
these
útils.
ideas that Dr.
La
Mansbridge works
relació
with
que hi ha entre
are
la participació
very,
ciutadana,
very
els debats
important,
parlamentaris,
among
les ciències
which
socials,
social
la
sciences and all
pública,
of
no? Que
these
deia Habermas.
representative
Aquesta és una altra qüestió molt
concepts.
important. Què fem un cop hem fet la
What do we
participació?
do
Què fem
once we
amb aquest
have checked
producte?
this
Doncs és una
participation?
reflexió,
What do
no?
we do with the
Aquesta
product
idea de
that we
sistema
get?
deliberatiu,
What do we do with
que
this
és molt important
deliberative
per entendre,
system?
no?
All
Quina
of these
trajectòria ha de tenir el resultat
systems
de la
are very important
participació
to
ciutadana,
understand which
i
are the
sobretot
results
no
of
ho
the
deixa pel final,
participants.
però el més important, i a més,
And it is very
estem al mes de
important,
març, s'ha de posar sobre la
especially
taula,
now here
és
in
la
March.
consciència de les
We have to
diferències
take into account
estructurals
the
que travessen
different
la participació. Qui tenim a
structural
dins
areas
i qui
that
tenim a
refer
fora,
to the
qui
participation.
parla i qui no parla,
Who is
qui
speaking, who is
influeix
not
i qui no
speaking,
influeix.
who
Per
is
tant,
influencing
no
the
és
decisions
simplement
and who
la massa
isn't.
ciutadana,
We should not
sinó que
only follow the
hi ha
citizen
unes diferències
mass,
estructurals que s'han
but
de
also
tractar
to
on un
understand
organitza aquest tipus
the differences among
d'actuacions.
us and to understand
I per
these
tant, el que
different actors.
esperem, per això que estem molt contents
And
com a
that's why
professionals de la ciència
we're
política i
very
la
happy
sociologia, és que la traducció d'aquest
as
llibre al
political
castellà
scientists
serveixi
to
per
have the
difondre
translation
aquests
of this book
conceptes
in
i que siguin
Spanish
més
to
accessibles
be
per tal
able
d'aconseguir una
to
democràcia
make
de
these
major
concepts
qualitat.
be understood
També vull
more
esmentar
widely.
la implicació de la professora Mansbridge
I would
amb la
also
ciència
like
política,
to
ja que
comment her
l'any 2013
implication
va ser la
in the
presidenta
political
de
science because in
l'Associació Americana
2013
de
she
Ciència
was
Política.
the
I
president of
bé,
the
jo diria
American
que,
Political Science
pel que tenim
Association.
entès, és una associació
And for
que
what we
d'alguna forma
understand,
sotmet les funcions
it's
que
an
tenim una mica
association
desdoblades.
that
Entre nosaltres som
is
un col·legi
similar
professional
on
més
us.
orientat
We
als
are a professional
practitioners
association more focused on the practitioners, but we have a Catalan association that is also based more on an academical side, and we work on cooperation with the same objectives. And my last words would be to thank the two counselors that are here today. They are both political scientists. One of them is Tania Verge, who is the Counselor of Equality and Feminism. It's the new counselor that she is managing. And also Dr. Alsina, who is the Counselor of Foreign Affairs and Open Government. And we are very lucky to have both of them here today, political scientists that are working in these two important areas that have so much to do one with the other. I would also like to thank Eugenia Bretones, the Vice President of the Women Group in Catalonia, and also in charge of the gender topics in the Professional Association, and also to Lidia Arroyo, who is also working to make this presentation a fact and to have it widely different. Last but not least, I would like to thank the people that is helping all of these to be a fact, especially Antoni Viernes, the manager, Montse Ortigosa, in charge of the communication, and Esther Fabregat, because without them, this would not be a fact. They are just behind, they're taking care of everything, but without them, this would not be an option. Without further ado, Lydia, the floor is yours. Thank you, Dr. Pacheco. And now I'm going to give the floor to Felipe Rey Salamanca. He is a very important part of this book. He was an editor and professor of the book published by Jane Mansbridge in Spanish, Democracia, Amistad, y PUGNA. He's been the editor and the translator of the book. He is a professor in the Pontificia University in Colombia. Felipe, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lydia. I would like to start thanking the institutions that organized this act regarding the work and the thinking of Jane Mansbridge and the presentation of this book. I would like also to say that we have another one coming up about feminism and power. I would like to talk about this question. Why do we have to read Jane Mansbridge? Of course, I'm sure that we have a lot of students that are going to see this video, or different political scientists, and the answer is that she renewed the vocab and the categories in political science, because she showed us that democracy is a friend, but is also a struggle. So she helps us understand the descriptive power that women have. She helps to defend her as well. She helps to understand the social movements and their role in deliberative systems. But these are not the main reasons in which I would like to focus on. What I would like to say, and I would like to repeat to students and to political scientists, is the following. We have to read Mansbridge because she shows a different way to think about politics. She shows us a different way to understand political science and democracy. I would like to focus on three main characteristics of her way of thinking. Three abilities, three characteristics that you can develop, and that are qualities that Jane has and that she's putting in her work. First of all, the listening capacity, the capacity to listen and to do inductive work, which is different to the political theory that we have or that Rawls has, that start the speculation or philosophic speculation, and then they start to get different conclusions, but Mansbridge shows us a different path, to start with a practic path, town meeting, different assemblies, and different participation ways. That's why her path doesn't have Aristoteles or Bernstein, Frank, Helen, Susan, Michael, the participants, especially in the gender movement of the 60s and 70s. Secondly, would be also the analytical rigor. And I would like to put it separately, not to have a single main category. We have different ways of representing it. We have different paths and different spaces for friendship and for struggle, indeed. And we would also like to talk about the normative contingency, to understand that after these differences, we can also apply different ideals. And with this, I'm going to finish. I think Mansbridge has opened us to a new world, a world of categories and ideals with contingencies that we try to condense in this book, Democracia, Amistad, y PUGNA. It has a study from the 80s of Jane Mansbridge and another one that has never been published in Spanish regarding recursive repression. It's in Spanish, we can read it, but it doesn't exist in English. It's a summary of her main contributions to the theory, democratic theory. We also have one called Democracia, Amistad, so democracy and friendship, because the book is a celebration of friendship as well. So that's why I would like to thank her being here today and her presence here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ray. And now we're going to listen to Eugenia Bretones, who is the second vice president of the National Council of Women in Catalonia, and she's also part of the Gender Commission in Catalonia as well. So there you go, you have the floor, Eugenia. Thank you very much, Lydia. First off, I wanted to thank you for inviting me here today. I represent more than 400 women associations, and we're very glad indeed to be here. And on behalf of these associations, we would like to thank you. And we also would like to express our admiration towards Dr. Mansbridge and to her contribution to politics, and specifically to political participation of women when talking about democracies, because women need to take part in the political landscape and they need to be part of the decision-making processes. Even though these social politics might be controversial sometimes. So when talking about her contribution, we would like to stress the importance of women being represented in the decision-making processes, especially women who are discriminated. Nowadays, in Catalonia, like it has already been mentioned, we are taking momentum because we are very democratic, and therefore we have also built a new ministry of equality and feminism. We are organizing ourselves and we are proposing new politics.
recollir la diversitat de veus de les dones,
What we would like to do with that is
cura de totes les veus que
to
poden
take into
o estan
account
oprimides
every
o no
woman
estan representades per les
and
múltiples
to
bretxes
see if
socials,
women are
culturals, de temps
discriminated
o
or do not
territorials,
have the same opportunities
incorporant
as
tota
men.
la interseccionalitat. I a nivell extern, el
So,
moment en el que estem actualment, també
externally,
pensem que per afavorir els processos de participació
we would also want
i enfortir la
to
democràcia és important que
reinforce
s'estableixin xarxes de diàleg
democracy and
i
establish
ajuda mútua
dialogue
amb altres
and
moviments
networks
feministes
with
internacionals que ens
other
permetin superar la
feminist
mirada
movements
feminista
all around the
eurocèntrica
world so that we can expand
i
our
poder
horizons
impulsar
and to
debats
see if we
ideològics
can
o
push
conceptuals,
new
tot i que hi hagi
debates
conflicte en el
to
debat,
talk about concepts,
que
to
són
talk
tan
about
necessaris
proposals.
en l'actualitat per superar
Because
des dels
these
feminismes
networks are very
les
important for feminism.
les diferents concepcions i ens sumem
We
cap a
need to
una
understand
transformació
different
social.
perspectives.
Per últim, ens agradaria
And
molt
last but not
seguir
least,
estudiant fórmules de
we
participació de
would
les
like to
dones
keep
en el si de la
exploring
vida
formulas to
institucional,
see how women can
reivindicant que es
participate in the political
profunditzi
landscape
la democràcia
and
obrint
to
espais de pensament on
highlight
sigui possible
that
discutir la
we should create
percepció que tenen els
spaces
homes
where
del
we
poder
can
des de la seva
talk
posició
about
privilegiada,
men's
així com
power
l'expressió de les
and
dones que ja
how
estan en
women
política.
can participate in politics as well.
És aquest el camí que pensem que hem de transitar
We think this is the
i
way to
agraïm
go,
molt poder
and
estar
we are
avui
very
aquí.
happy and
Gràcies.
honored to be here today. Thank you.
Moltes gràcies, senyora
Thank you very
Bretones.
much,
I ara
Eugenie
donem pas
Bertons.
a la intervenció de la honorable
Now,
consellera
we give the
doctora
floor to
Victòria Alsina
the
i Burgués,
Honorable
que és la
Dr.
consellera
Victoria
del
Alsina
Departament d'Acció
y
Exterior i
Burgués,
Govern Exterior de la Generalitat
who
de
is the
Catalunya.
Minister of
Endavant,
Foreign Affairs
consellera.
and Open Government of Catalonia. You have the floor.
Hola a tots, moltíssimes gràcies.
Hi,
De fet,
everybody.
em fa molta il·lusió
Thank you for having
participar
me.
en
I'm
aquest
so
acte
glad and happy to be here today
us
with all of
confirmo que
you.
aquest passat
And
cap de
I
setmana
can
vaig
confirm
començar
you that I already started reading
a
the book.
fullejar el llibre que moltes parts havia llegit en
And
altres
indeed, I
fragments.
have already had the
Estimo
pleasure to
moltíssim
read
i
many
em
of the
sembla
articles
que
that are
l'obra
included in it,
de la professora
but I'm
Mansbridge,
still in
Hi
awe of
Jenny,
her
so good to see you
contribution.
online. És una obra imprescindible
It's a pleasure
per
to see
qualsevol
you, and
persona que li
it's a
interessi la
vital
participació, per
book
qualsevol persona que li
to
interessi
read
la
for any of
representació.
us
I, de fet,
who are
volia
interested in
felicitar
these
molt
topics.
especialment el Felipe
And I
Rey,
would also
que ha
like
fet
to
aquesta traducció comentada i
congratulate
molt
Felipe
ho
because
expliquen
he's
totes
done a
aquestes
great work
converses
translating
que jo crec
and
que acaben de fer entendre
editing
molt i molt
this
bé
book.
quin és el
I
valor
think
de l'obra
it's
de la professora Mansbridge
your work
i
has been
com
very important
això ens
to
pot ser molt
put
útil a dia d'avui. Per tant, volia
the
començar amb
work
aquesta
of Dr.
felicitació
Manbridge into the
als autors
spotlight.
i
So
aquest agraïment per
thank you
poder
very
estar
much,
aquí amb
Felipe,
tots
for doing that
vosaltres,
because
amb la
it's
meva
an excellent work.
col·lega de la Pompeu Fabra i ara
And
actualment
I'm
col·lega
so
del
happy to
govern,
see
la consellera
many
Verge,
of
per suposat,
many friends
doncs, amb
here,
el
many
senyor
colleagues,
Pacheco
also
del
Tanya
Col·legi de
Verge.
Politòlegs. Moltíssimes
And
gràcies per
also
ajuntar-nos
thank
avui
you to
aquí.
the
I amb els
organizers of
professors
this
Josep Lluís
event,
Martí,
Josep Luis
Rosa,
Martí,
totes les
also
cares
Dr.
conegudes que
Jordi
veig online.
Pacheco, all
Moltíssimes gràcies.
the familiar faces that I see
Bé,
today
jo estava
in this
pensant
event.
realment quin era
And
el missatge, no?, que li volia compartir
I was
a
thinking
la
about what I
professora Mansbridge,
wanted
que
to
us volia
say
compartir a tots
today,
vosaltres en relació al
that I
contingut
wanted
d'aquest
to
llibre i el
say
que
about
representa
what this
la
book
seva obra. I en
really
aquest sentit,
represents.
jo volia explicar-vos,
And
clar, una experiència molt
of
personal,
course,
que és
I have to
haver-me
think of
dedicat
my
els
personal
últims anys
experiences these
a
last
recercar
years.
i a
I've
estudiar des
been
d'una perspectiva
conducting
molt diferent
research
tots els temes
from
de
a
govern
different
obert, que inclouen
perspectives,
aquesta
of course. Now
transparència, que
I'm in the
inclouen aquesta
government,
participació,
and
dades
I've been thinking
obertes,
a lot
nova
about
governança,
participation,
etc., des de
transparency,
l'acadèmia, i
governance,
el que
and so
suposa
on.
després fer aquest canvi i
It's a
analitzar
quite a
aquestes mateixes
change
coses
for
des de la
me, of course,
perspectiva
because
d'haver de
now
fer polítiques
I'm in
públiques
an
i
active role. I
implementar-les.
need to
Fins i tot quan estàs a
carry out
l'acadèmia i quan
social
estàs
policies and so
donant
on and so forth.
recomanacions a altres persones sobre
And
què han de fer, no és el mateix
it's not the
i
same,
realment
right,
no és el
as being in
mateix
the
que
academic
si tu
world
estàs i ho has de
and
tirar
analyzing
endavant, la perspectiva
the
que tens
landscape from a different perspective.
és diferent. Jo
It
recordo,
has
per
indeed
exemple,
been a huge
centrant-nos en l'àmbit de
change.
la participació, que és l'àmbit que avui ens ocupa,
And regarding
que
participation,
quan et mires totes les oportunitats participatives, doncs
when
bé, jo diria que hi ha tres
sometimes
preocupacions
we take a look
o
at the
tres
participation,
limitacions,
we
no?, que de
shall
seguida un
talk
veu
about
quan intenta
three
analitzar
main
i
challenges, so to
teoritzar
say.
casos
when
concrets,
starting
sobre experiències pràctiques.
analyzing
Jo crec que
specific
quan parlem de participació,
examples.
moltes vegades ens hem fixat molt en
Sometimes
mecanismes de
we
participació
talk about
que es fixen molt en les
participation
opinions i les
mechanisms that are
preferències de les
focused
persones
on
i a
opinions, on
vegades no ens hem
personal
centrat tant en
opinions, for
mecanismes de
example.
participació que també recopilen tot aquest
And
coneixement expert, totes les idees que tenen les
sometimes
persones, les entitats,
we also
per la seva
try
vida, per la seva experiència
to talk
professional,
about
pels seus
personal
interessos. Per tant, aquest és
interests
un
of
primer
people
element que es veu
and
quan
social
s'analitzen
movements, social
casos reals de
trends,
participació. Un segon element
right?
és que,
And
per
then we
suposat, i
also
és molt
have
important,
a second
ens hem
element,
preocupat molt quan parlem
which
de
is that
participació de
we've
parlar
also
de la
talked
legitimitat i
a
com
lot
millorar la
about
legitimitat amb els processos
legitimacy and to
participatius.
how to improve
I a
it
vegades, això
in
és
these
fonamental, però no hem posat un
participative
accent
processes.
en com millorar també
We have also
l'eficàcia o l'eficiència
highlighted
d'aquests processos, perquè a
how
vegades això
to
ajuda
make this
que
process
siguin
more
possibles
efficient,
o dona arguments extras
more
per
visible, right?
justificar-los.
Because
I la
this
tercera
helps us to
dimensió de
understand
la
them as well
participació,
much
per fer
better.
una reflexió de grup,
And
seria
also,
precisament amb la dificultat de
we have
digerir
been
aquesta
dealing
informació,
about
perquè si el
how
procés
difficult it
participatiu
is
va
to
bé,
understand
llavors hi ha la
something like
dificultat
this.
afegida de com digereixes i com
How
aprofites, perquè els ciutadans
we can
sentin que el temps
understand
que
these
han
concepts
invertit
and how we can
realment és útil, perquè té una
give them to
translació en
society
la presa de
and to
decisions
make sure that
públiques.
people
Aquests són tres
understand these
elements, tres
concepts,
reflexions
right? So we
al
have
voltant
these
de la
three
participació que lliguen
thoughts,
una
three
mica
challenges
algun
around
dels debats
participation
teòrics
that are
que la professora
very
Mansbridge
important
planteja
indeed
des de diferents punts de vista
in
i que en
the
aquesta obra
political
queden molt ben recopilats
debates,
amb el que és l'experiència pràctica
and that are
de
very
quan t'has
much
de posar a
tackled
dissenyar
in
polítiques públiques
Dr. Mansbridge's
participatives. Bé,
contributions.
aquí s'afegeix el repte de com institucionalitzar-ho.
So
I amb
we have
algunes
another challenge
dificultats
added to
en
that, which is
particular que té
how
el
to
sector públic,
add
que és aquesta
or
com
how
ho
to
regulo, he de regular-ho,
introduce
no he de
these concepts
regular-ho,
into
puc fer
the
una
institutions,
regulació tova,
how
com
to
faig
assess
pilots
these
sense que sembli que
concepts in the
estic
institutions, and how to
desaprofitant recursos públics en cas de que el pilot no surti bé.
really
I en tercer lloc, jo
be
diria
efficient
com fer
and
tota la
try to take
formació
profit of
als
these
funcionaris, a les
concepts
persones que treballen al sector públic.
in the
Aquests són tres
practice.
reptes que un es troba sobre la taula
So these
quan
are
es posa a
challenges
implementar
indeed
aquestes coses.
when we are
Formació de
trying to
funcionaris,
implement
com faig
in a
experiments
practical
per saber què
way
funciona i què no
these
funciona,
kind
i com
of
faig aquesta
concepts, right?
regulació i
So
en quin
how
moment la
to
faig.
assess
Jo volia fer aquesta
the processes
reflexió
and how to
perquè
implement them
jo
efficiently.
recordo que quan vaig
I
començar a
remember
llegir
when I started
textos de la professora
reading
Mansbridge, em va fer pensar molt
articles
en com
of
analitzar
Professor
teòricament
Mansbridge,
tots aquests
I
temes.
started to think
I
about
crec
how
que
to
en aquest
analyze
àmbit
these
de
topics.
la participació, aquestes
And
reflexions
I think when it
teòriques
comes to
íntimament
participation,
lligades a casos concrets
these
són el que realment ens fa tenir
these
un discurs que
participation
sigui
concepts
útil per
are
tirar endavant i per
inextricably
entendre
linked to
què hem de fer en
specific
aquest àmbit.
examples that help us to understand what we should
Faig aquesta
do
reflexió perquè
in this regard.
segurament si no hagués llegit i si no hagués
So,
après de totes aquestes
hadn't I
reflexions
read
que
these
planteja l'obra de la
contributions, these
professora Mansbridge,
articles
i que
of
tenim
Dr.
també
Mansbridge
recopilades des d'una
that we have in
perspectiva
this
molt integral
book,
en aquest llibre, no sabria com
I
afrontar molts dels
probably
reptes
wouldn't have
pràctics,
known how
però
to tackle these
afrontant
issues
molts
in a
d'aquests reptes
practical way.
pràctics, molts cops,
But I
Jenny,
do
se
have to
m'apareixen
say
1000
that
preguntes que et farien com traslladar això
sometimes
en
I would
l'àmbit
like to
teòric.
ask you
Per tant,
1,000
jo crec que
questions
aquest és un
when
llibre
trying to
interessant des de
implement
la
these concepts,
perspectiva
right?
d'un
It's
teòric, des de
sometimes
la perspectiva
difficult
d'un pràctic, i
because
encara
in a
més si
practical
t'interessen les
way, in
dues
the
coses, com
practical
és el meu
world, it
cas.
might be very
Simplement
challenging
acabar
indeed.
agraint-li molt i
So
molt i molt
thank you
a la
very
Jenny que
much
estigui
for
avui amb
being
nosaltres i al
here.
Felipe per haver
It's a
fet
pleasure
possible
to
aquesta
see
obra i
you.
al
Thank you,
Col·legi de
Felipe,
Politòlegs
for
per
doing
unir-nos
this
a tots. Moltes
great work.
gràcies.
And I'm so happy to be here and to see you. Thank you.
Moltes gràcies, honorable
Thank you
consellera.
very
I
much.
ara ha arribat el moment d'escoltar
And
a
now
l'autora,
it's time
Jane
to give the
Mansbridge.
floor
És
to
un
Dr.
honor
Mansbridge.
poder
It's
tenir-la aquí
such
avui
a
amb
pleasure to have you
nosaltres.
here with us.
Ella, com sabeu, és referent mundial en
She's
l'àmbit de la
such
ciència
a
política, la
reference
democràcia i els moviments socials, no? amb
in
aquest moviment també des del feminisme, que tan important és també
in political
per
science
nosaltres,
and
des
also
del
in
Col·legi de
feminism,
Professionals
something
de
that's
Ciència
also very
Política i
important
Sociologia i la Comissió de Gènere en
to
particular.
us.
És professora de l'Escola de
She's
Govern Kennedy de la Universitat
also
de Harvard
professor
i
at
no,
the
la seva
Harvard Kennedy School of
trajectòria,
Government, and
tota
she
la
has
seva
had an
aportació a
incredible
l'acadèmia l'ha
career.
reconegut com a estat presidenta de l'Associació de
She has
Ciència
served as
Política dels
president
Estats
of the
Units.
American Political
Va
Science
rebre el
Association
2018 el Premi
and has
Johan
contested,
Skytte,
among
que és el
others,
considerat
the
el
Johan
Nobel de la
Skytte
Ciència
Prize in
Política,
Political
però a
Science, which is
més, el seu gran
considered the Nobel
mèrit és
Prize
que
of
ho ha fet
Politics.
des de
And
la
she's
seva
done
posició no situada
everything
i activista,
from
com a feminista,
her
com a persona
own
històrica que
feminist and
s'ha
activist
compromès als
position.
moviments
She
socials
has shown a
i ha
great
fet
commitment,
teoria des de la seva
and
vida.
she has developed
Us
theory
recomano
from her own
molt
point
el
of
llibre
view.
i com ella explica, no? La Jane
It's
també
incredible to read all her articles and to see how she talks about theory and about political science from her own perspective and from her own commitment to social change and feminism, so that people can have a better life. And this is something that's very valuable to society. And from our position, from Europe, from Catalonia, it is very important to have your contribution. And it's important to listen to others, to listen to you, to learn from your career and to see how we can push dialogue forward and learn from you and from what you've done. Because we're indeed experiencing dark times, and we think it's important to listen to each other to create a better world. So you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm truly honored to be here today and honored by these wonderful introductions. Thank you all very, very much. So, you know, the times in which I wrote that first book on democracy were very different from our times today. They were times of hope, and ours are more times of fear. But the combination is not bad. Hope expands the mind, and fear concentrates it. Hope generates alternatives, and fear starts you calculating which alternative can we use to get out of this trap. So I did the research for that first book, Beyond Adversary Democracy, in the 60s, and it was definitely a time of hope. The economy was booming, everyone had a job, we were going to change the world, we were going to end racism and patriarchy, establish participatory democracy. I was a member of 4 different collectives, my friends were members of other collectives, all trying to govern ourselves as pure democracies with no inequality in power. But all of our collectives were failing to achieve that goal. People were turning against one another and blaming one another for failing to achieve that goal. So I studied the 2 most egalitarian collectives I could find. And I found that, yes, they too had significant inequalities. But in the second case, at the end of interviewing each person, I asked some version of, are you comfortable with the inequalities you've got in this organization? And a surprising number said they were fairly comfortable with those inequalities. These are people who'd given up a lot for the equality in their organization. Some of them were people with law degrees who were earning the same salaries as people who hadn't graduated from high school. They were committed to equality, and yet they were comfortable with some of these inequalities. And so I pursued why. And I figured out that people usually don't want equal power for its own sake. They want equal respect. They want their interests protected. They want the opportunity to grow by taking responsibility. So I developed what I now call a contingency analysis. The more you have by other means, equal respect, common interests, and the opportunity to grow, the less important equal power is. The importance of equal power is contingent on the context. So 2 directions came out of that research: commonality and contingency. First, commonality. In both of my small democracies, I found that the members had far more common interests than on the national scale. And they had many conflicting interests too. The key to a successful democracy is to be able to move back and forth between the common and the conflicting interests in our institutions, as well as conceptually and emotionally. Friendship and struggle, how to keep them both going, how to move from one another appropriately, contingent on context, how not to let the imperatives of one crush the other. We, the human race, are only slowly learning how to make these back and forth moves from commonality to conflict. We must find new mechanisms for how to do this. And we must develop understandings of democracy that encompass that fluidity. Jürgen Habermas and John Rawls and others were critical in helping reestablish the importance to democracy of deliberation on the common good. But broadly speaking, just as the political science of the 1960s stressed only conflict, they stressed only commonality. My colleagues and I, in the introduction to the Oxford Handbook on Deliberative Democracy, thus called deliberating to consensus a first generation ideal. The second generation ideal is that deliberation should both facilitate consensus and clarify conflict. The mixture of facilitating consensus and clarifying conflict that is appropriate in any institution or moment is contingent on, among other things, the context of underlying interests. My recent work on legislative negotiation reflects the same interest in democratic institutions that facilitate the flow between commonality and conflict. Instead of opposing deliberation to bargaining, we should see that good legislative negotiation, like good business negotiation, requires a lot of talking, a lot of question asking, and active listening to craft solutions to problems that meet as many interests as possible for some at the lowest cost for others. So my colleagues and I have called that talking and listening and question asking deliberative negotiation. The deliberation both clarifies conflict and then helps the parties find solutions to which all can agree. So finally, I'll touch briefly on my work on representation. I break from the reigning interpretation in political science of the constituent representative relationship as conflictual. Of course, relations between constituents and representatives have conflictual elements. Populist movements rightly spring up when elites, including elected elites, pursue interests that conflict with the interests of their constituents, even if those interests are ideological, not material. But relations between constituents and representatives need not be conflictual. In political science, one implicitly conflictual model is what I call promissory representation. Candidates for election make promises, and if they do not fulfill those promises while in office, then the constituents punish them at the next election by kicking them out. Another relatively conflictual model is what I call anticipatory representation. It's a business model. Representatives anticipate what their constituents will want by the time of the next election, and then act to meet those anticipated wants to increase their chances of re-election. It's all about re-election. Now, there's another model that's a little bit less conflictual, and that's what I call gyroscopic representation. In this model, representatives do not choose their actions for fear of the constituent sanctions. Rather, the representatives act like gyroscopes in the center of a ship, keeping in one direction through a storm. And as for the constituents, instead of trying to change the representatives' actions by threatening sanctions at the next election, they select among the different gyroscopes, each of them pointing in a different direction, and place one in the legislature. So in its pure form, and none of these forms appears in pure form in reality, they're all in reality mixed, but in its pure form, selection among gyroscopic representatives is what I call a selection model, not a sanction model. In the sanction model, constituents exercise power over their representatives, getting the representatives to do what those representatives would otherwise not do through the threat of sanction. In the selection model, the constituents exercise power over the legislature, not the representative, by getting the legislature to do what it would otherwise not do, by placing a particular in the legislature, a particular representative going in a particular direction. It's probably not surprising that constituents and representatives both prefer gyroscopic representation, the selection model. If you think of an elected representative that best represents you, you're probably thinking of a selection model with a gyroscopic representative, not a promissory or anticipatory model of representation. And what accountability means is contingent on the kind of representation. In a selection model, based on relatively common interests between the represented and the representative, accountability means giving an account, explaining why you're doing something that's not expected, that the constituent didn't expect you to do. So that's accountability, giving an account. In a sanction model, accountability means monitoring and sanctioning. When you hear people saying, we want accountability, it means we want to be able to punish. It's a different model. So now I haven't spoken of the importance of seeing elected representatives as part of a larger representative system, about which Felipe has written, that includes representation in the administrative branches, as well as the societal arena, representation in labor unions, representation in NGOs, how that all fits into the larger representative system. And I haven't spoken of seeing deliberation as a system, and seeing deliberation in any particular forum as part of that larger deliberative system, in which different arenas have different functions. In such a deliberative system, some political arenas, some political places like places of protest, may have relatively low deliberative quality. They may not listen to their opponents. That's very low deliberative quality. Nevertheless, those places can add something to the deliberative system if we think of it as a whole. And I haven't also spoken of what I call, but I may be able to come back to it, what I call recursive representation, where the ideal is mutually responsive constituent representative communication. But for much of these ideas, you'll have to buy the volume. Thank you so much for inviting me today. I look forward to seeing some of you in Barcelona in the fall as well. And I look forward very much to these questions. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Mansbridge.
Gracias, professora.
I ara passem a l'espai de col·loqui en el que diferents persones
Move ahead
representants de
to
diferents
the
institucions de
question parts,
Catalunya
and
formularan una pregunta.
we're going to have different
Professora Mansbridge
speakers
respondrà.
asking
Tindrem 10
questions
minuts
to
per
Dr.
cada
Mansbridge. We're going to have 10 minutes for each intervention, taking into account the question and the answer. We're going to have first
Victoria Alsina i Burguès.
the Chancellor Victoria Alsina and
Moltes
Burguès.
gràcies.
Thank you very much.
Jenny.
Thank you very much,
De fet,
Jenny.
et podria
In
fer
fact,
moltíssimes
I could
preguntes
ask a lot of
que has
questions
explicat i del que no has explicat
regarding what
en
you
aquest resum, però te'n volia
explained
fer
and what you
dues
didn't explain.
que
But I
crec
would like
que
to
connecten
put
una mica
two
moltes
specific
coses que
questions on the
expliques
table,
en
and
el
I
llibre i
think they
moltes coses
connect
sobre les quals tu
two
has
dots
treballat
that you
amb el que
referred
són
to in the
els
book.
reptes del moment polític actual en el que vivim i en com traslladar-ho tot això en el sector públic. Per tant, et volia fer una doble
You
pregunta.
bring all of these in the public sector. I would like to ask, first of all,
una pregunta que és, jo diria, fàcil i difícil, no?
an
Perquè
easy
una
and
pregunta molt bàsica,
hard
però és una
question.
pregunta,
I
jo
would
crec,
like to ask a
a
very
vegades
basic
complicada de
question, but
contestar, o
it's also
no
a
ho sé,
question
és
that
una
is
pregunta
hard
per
to reply
pensar-hi, no?
sometimes, or at
És a
least a
dir, en el
question
moment
that makes us
polític
think.
actual que viuen les
We
nostres
are
democràcies, en el
now
moment
living
polític
a
que viuen els
specific
nostres sistemes
democratic moment,
administratius,
and our systems
tu
are going
creus
through
que
a
les
moment.
persones, que els
Do you think
ciutadans
that this situation right
realment
now
volen participar
has
i
citizens
com
that
hem de
want to
fer aquesta
participate on it,
participació,
and
com
how
hem
should we
d'organitzar en
have
el
this
moment en el que estem
participation?
vivint tots
How
aquests
should we
processos
organize all of
deliberatius
these deliberative
perquè realment
processes
funcionin i perquè
in order to
realment
make
siguin
them work
productius.
and in order to make them
Sabeu que és una
productive?
pregunta molt directa, no? És a dir, com ho hem de
It's
fer-ho
a very
en el moment
straightforward
polític actual, amb la polarització que hi ha, amb la
question, and
desinformació,
the thing would
amb els
be
populismes, amb com
regarding the
funcionen les xarxes
populism,
socials, amb els temes que
all of
preocupen
the
els
problems
ciutadans. Com ho hem de traslladar tot
and
això? És a dir,
misinformation that
quin
we have
tipus de
right now.
participació hem de
Which
fer
type of
perquè la gent
participation
tingui
should
ganes de
we have
participar
in order
i
to
perquè
have
aquest
people
procés deliberatiu funcioni?
participate and willing to
Aquesta seria
participate in this
la meva
political
pregunta principal.
arena? This would be my main question. And my second question would be, how could we measure if this is working or if this is not working? And this is it. This would be my main two questions, and looking forward to the reflection that go with them.
Great. Thank you so much, Victoria. It's a big and important question. How do we, in this moment of lowered legitimacy and some would say democratic crisis, bring our citizens into greater participation? Because not all citizens, as you know, whether your question implies, not all citizens want to participate. There are many citizens who have pressing lives. They've got two jobs, they're in precarious situations, they've got children, they've got tremendous responsibilities. Going to a meeting is the farthest possible thing from their minds. And even voting might take just too much time out of the day. So you have people under great duress. You also have people who are cynical. What difference does it make? They're all going to do what they want to do anyway. The corporations, the elites, they're running things. There's no point in all this. So those are tremendous problems, and I would say there is no one solution. And I think that the door-to-door approach is a very good approach. We've mechanized a great deal of the get out the vote, and mechanized in the United States at any rate quite a lot of the processes. We have people from Massachusetts writing to people in Georgia and saying you should vote. That's fine, but it's not their neighbors. It's not their neighbors asking them if they voted. So we have to find ways, and I think you in the past have found some of these ways in Barcelona per se, of really connecting with citizens. Poor people also, move from house to house. They're not always in the same place. So you can't just expect the registration rolls and so forth to tell you where people are. I think, don't forget, women hold up half the sky. I think that the participation of women bringing out women is important. And I think I'll talk later, I think, a little bit about recursive representation. Mechanisms that can connect citizens with their representatives in authentic ways are good. You may know of Mike Neblow's work with his colleagues. The book is called Democracy with the Citizens, I think. At any rate, he organized in the US Congress. They have huge constituencies because the US is such a big place. But nevertheless, he was able to figure out ways in which a random sample of 175 citizens could speak with their representative through the internet, ask questions. Not everyone could ask a question, but afterwards in the interviews, people did say that they felt heard, that they felt that their questions had been asked by others, and the representatives answered and so forth. And there was tremendous boost in actual participation afterwards, but also a boost in efficacy, a feeling of agency, a feeling of that I as a citizen can actually connect with my representative. And these were only on one topic, and they were big topics like immigration or terrorism. So this he figured out that even in the United States, if every representative just did that for 2 hours a week, in 6 years, they could cover a quarter of their constituents. That's a lot. That would mean, if that were institutionalized, that all of us could expect to be in such dialogue a couple of times in our lifetimes. Our friends would have just been doing it. We would talk about it. So that's one way. But as I said before, in just plain old knocking on doors, you asked what type of participation we should have. And I would say every kind, including the bad kinds. By bad, I mean, would never approve of violent protests in any circumstances, but they're hate-filled protests that are, I think, it would be very easy to say that it would just be better if we had zero of them. The problem is that people feel hate, and what we want to do is to find ways of having them not feel hate. I'm not sure that telling people they can't ever express it is the best way of reducing hate. So, but I would say we need all kinds of participations. We need a balance, and we need to encourage as much as we can the productive kind of participation, like the participation in citizens' assemblies, the participation in these 175-person talks with your representative, participation where you and participation in protest, because protest is an extraordinary amount of deliberation in protest, actually. As you're carrying the sign, you sort of point to someone else's sign and you say to them, what do you mean by that? You know, and they say what. So there's, so I would encourage very large amounts of participation, but particularly the kind in which people of opposite views, as in citizens' assemblies, as elected by lot, can come together in a reasonable setting where they're introduced to one another as human beings and can come to understand to some degree the other's perspective. That would be, in my view, the very best form. Now, how can we measure whether or not it's working? You can measure, of course, people before and after a particular thing like a citizens' assembly, and there you get these massive both changes in opinion, but also changes in citizen efficacy and plans to participate more. And then if you measure it down the pike, you could see that they do participate more. Those are ways of measuring, but how do you measure in the country as a whole? We have these measures of trust in government, and they're not bad. Denmark does quite well. Denmark has not seen a drop in legitimacy. And I think it bears asking why. One reason is their strong decentralization. They had a move toward what they called municipalization. It's a small country, but they decentralized within that small country, and that made trust in government go way up. I used a causal. After that, trust in government went up. It looks as if it's causal. I can't actually swear that was the reason for the growth in legitimacy. But so we can learn from one country can learn from another, and I think you can measure. Things like trust in government over time. Thanks for that great question.
Thank you, Professor Mansbridge. I ara el doctor Jordi Pacheco i Canals, com a degà del Col·legi Professional d'Associacions de Política i Sociologia, formularà una altra pregunta.
Jordi Pacheco and Canals.
Gràcies, Lídia.
Thank you very much, Lydia. During the last 25 years, we've seen the development of the deliberative theories. And some of us believe this is an instrument that might improve democracy and its quality. So then we have Twitter, Facebook, and then we say, wow, this is extraordinary, right? It's like democratizing society. This is it. And then with the Arab Spring and everything, we saw, oh, this is something that might be better. But now we have fake news, polarization, we have populism. And we have now a different feeling, right? And everything evolves. So my question would be, are you pessimist or are you positive when it comes to this development of society?
Well, you might not be surprised to learn that I mix pessimism and optimism, but I am still optimistic. Before and during World War II, many thought that the refined means of propaganda that then could newly reach that population through radio and film would spell the end of democracy. So it was a very similar moment in which this new technology was bringing propaganda to the masses, and many were very seriously extremely worried, and Hitler, they saw the results and they thought this was the end of democracy. But over time, I think, and they weren't wrong about those dangers, but I think over time, human beings have developed some abilities to detect and resist some of the worst features of propaganda, including its capacity, like social media, to tap into our deepest emotions, our fears and angers and in-group, out-group hatreds. But human beings are learning machines. We now have the new tool of the Citizen Assembly drawn by lot. And many polities are experimenting with new forms of that Citizens Assembly. From the East Belgian, I don't know if you know about the East Belgian integration of the Citizens Assembly into Parliament. Actually, it's the first group to do that, first polity to do that. And the itinerant Citizens Assembly in Bogota that Felipe has done wonderful, very innovative design with 3 iterations, one that sets the agenda, one that decides, and one that evaluates. We're very much in the experimental mode with these citizens' assemblies. And we have new tools to make these elected representatives more recursive, like the one I just mentioned, using the internet to bring these citizens together with their representatives once or twice a week. So these I consider balancing mechanisms, but at the moment they're relatively ineffective. And one reason I think is that they get practically no publicity. They're expensive to run these citizen assemblies, but they're not sexy. They don't, you know, the rule in journalism is if it bleeds, it leads. Well, citizens assemblies don't bleed. They reach moderate, good conclusions. They talk together. This just isn't, it's not very, you know, it's not snappy. It's very hard to make the evening news. So I think we have to exercise a certain amount of ingenuity in understanding how to bring the results of citizens' assemblies to the public. One way being the connection with Parliament in various formal ways. We'll see. We're in the experimental mode. So I'd say we need to make sure that the larger public receives not only these strident messages from social media, but also the deliberative messages from citizens who've taken the time to learn about a policy issue and deliberate it with citizens of different views. We don't know yet how to get that across. It may be impossible, but I don't think we're just at the beginning. I wouldn't rule out yet that we can find ways of bringing those other citizen voices out. That's one ray of hope that I see. Take it or leave it.
Thank you very much, Professor Mansbridge. I ara donem pas al doctor Josep Lluís Martí Mármol.
I'll give the floor to Dr. Josep Lluís Martí Mármol, and she belongs to the Law Department of the University of Pompeu Fabra. Thank you very much, Lydia. I'm going to speak in Catalan because you have a translation. It's a bit weird for me because it's the first time that I'm going to talk in Catalan to Jenny after so many years. And I wanted to ask you something that is pretty much related to the question of Jordi, and it's something that we have already tackled during the years. We met in 2005, so we've been discussing this topic a long time. And as Felipe was mentioning, I've also learned so much from your articles, Jenny, and she's a writer that we need to take into account. Her contribution is great nowadays, and we take a different perspective of the political landscape. And something that's concerning is she says that she grew up and learned a lot from the 60s and the movements for women's rights, for example. And this was a time of hope, but now we've lost this hope, right? And we've not lost this hope, but we have we're more scared, right?
A mi m'agrada, per mi ha estat sempre molt important, molt interessant aprendre el que ella m'explicava d'aquests moviments dels anys 60.
I've learned so much from her and from the 60s movements, and to reflect on that time And not only in the US, but also in Europe, for example. We fought for democracy, for freedom, right? And it was also a time to dream, right? We had so many social leaders, political leaders, and this word, dream, was a huge one, right? It was a vast word. So now we're here. It's 2022, and now we have this platform, social networks. And my question would be, how can we face the challenges that we're facing today? How can we overcome them? We're amid a pandemic and we're suffering the consequences. Now there's war, of course, and we have huge challenges ahead. And these challenges are different from the challenges that we or the people had in the 60s. And of course, the challenges back then were very important as well. But now the nature of the challenges are different. They are global challenges, huge challenges. So I wanted to ask you, how could we, how can we have democracy at a global level? How can we push democracy forward at a global level? I want to think that we should still have hope and to dream, right? And I'm positive, and especially young people should have this hope and this courage, and they should feel connected to this idea of global democracy. What do you think about that?
Well, it's, as you know, it's a huge problem. I think that we need, I of course go to the world of ideas. I think we need to bring every brain in the universe to bear on this problem. That means the brains of people in different parts of the world coming from different cultures. It means women, that's 50% of the human race. It means people who have a whole set of different shared experiences who can help think this through, because we're still operating in democracy, at least with an 18th century model. It's not enough. I'm not able to give. I struggle toward it with ideas like recursive representation and so forth, but I'm not able to sort of lay out a blueprint for how it ought to look in the next 20 years. But what I can say is that we need all of us thinking about it. And I'd like us to be thinking along the lines of free rider problems, which I've tried to explain in some of my works. And I'll just touch on here for a moment for those who are listening who are not familiar with the work. Back in the middle of the last century, a group of theorists, game theorists mostly, and economists working separately, many of them coming to the way human brains work. We think collectively. It's rare that there's just this amazing one genius who thinks about it all. So they came up with a solution. They came up with a logic of collective action, and it's all based on the idea of a free use good. That there are many goods that once you produce them, anybody can use them. And I call that a free use good. Something, you produce it, it's a road, it's a toll-free road, anybody can use it. You don't have to pay, it's produced already. And therefore, because you don't have to pay, nobody does pay. So how are you going to produce it? How are you going to pay for the road? You can get people to, I visited Yugoslavia relatively soon after the war, and I saw young people actually breaking up rocks and making the road. They were doing that out of solidarity and duty. And you can get some roads built out of solidarity and duty, especially if you tap into young people. But you usually have to have taxes, and you have to have a little bit of, and people will pay their taxes out of solidarity and duty. You usually have to have a little bit of coercion there around the edges to say, if you don't pay your taxes, you'll be put in jail, because otherwise the people who pay it out of solidarity and duty will just feel like taken up like suckers. So you have to have some coercion. The more you need free use goods, the more you need things like roads, of course, law and order, common defense, all the classic reasons for government were free use goods once you think about it logically. But now we've got these massive free use goods like a stable climate, the biggest free use good of them all. Once it's produced, we all can enjoy it for free. So how do you create the coercion that's going to bring people together to give to solve that problem? And that coercion to work, to be efficient as well as to be moral, has to be legitimate. We just haven't figured out a way of making the coercion we need for the interdependent future we're facing legitimate enough to carry the huge burden that we now have of increasing, I hate to say it to the libertarians out there, but we're going to face a world of increasing government coercion. We have to, in order to solve these large collective action free rider problems. So that means we have to think very hard about how to make that coercion more legitimate than it is now. And that, I think, is something where the minds and the brains of everyone from their own shared experience can help us figure out how to make that coercion more legitimate. I would say we just have to enlist the world in this problem. We're not going to solve it in Barcelona or even on the Zoom. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mansbridge. And now tenim a la doctora Rosa Borge Bravo.
And now we have Dr. Rosa Borge Bravo. She's political scientist and part of the Universitat Oberta de Catalunya.
Group Communications Networks
and she's part of the group Communications Networks and Social Change from the same university. So there you go, you have the floor. You're muted. Thank you. Thank you very much, Lydia, and thank you to Colpis for inviting me and having me in this very interesting debate. And I'm very glad to be here and to be able to ask questions. And the rest of participants, of course, to take part in this debate. It's such a pleasure to see so many people here. And I think Dr. Mansbridge is one of the greatest references that we have in the political science world, and where she's one of the best and one of the greatest researchers in this regard. So I focus a lot on digital communication and online communication, also in social networks. So my question is very similar to the one from Jordi Pacheco's, maybe a follow-up question. And nowadays, many experts, many individuals think that public digital networks, so our digital communication that takes place on social media, blogs, and other platforms, is substituting the public dialogue. And it's now the main place of debate, or the main space where we communicate. And I wanted to ask for your opinion, Dr. Mansbridge, if you agree on that, if you really think that this is the new space where we communicate, and if you think that this space is important. And my second question would be if you consider that this digital communication space is contributing positively to public debate, or if these platforms might pose a problem in the future for democracy. Thank you.
Yes, well, I'm going to have to learn from you a bit in this, and other people who actually studied this sphere. But I think it's obvious to any citizen that digital communication is very important. I don't think it's replacing the traditional public sphere, but it's supplementing it in transformative ways. Of course, the main positive feature of it is the new media's openness to all, or at least to all who have internet skills and connections, which often doesn't include the poor, but maybe it may as in the future as cities and localities put in broadband. We can't predict the future on that, but I think we can predict that the people with greater education and greater sense of self-confidence and so forth will tend to dominate any form of media, and that they'll probably have more influence in digital communication as well. I don't think we're going to get rid of inequality, even though it's more open. And the dangers are, I think, obvious also to any citizen, and I must be very obvious to you who studied it, that the main negative is what goes viral is often extreme, because it appeals to these visceral human reactions without reflection or deliberation. Now, every so often, social media can be deliberative. In the last few days on the subject of the Ukraine war, for example, I've engaged in Facebook with other academics who have among them very different views about the war. And we've posted back and forth, and I've learned a great deal from them. That wouldn't have been possible. I'm talking with people in different continents. That wouldn't have been possible in another era. And that was actually on Facebook. Then there's, of course, email lists. I'm on a socialist feminist email list, and I hear reactions both to the war and to other things through that email list. And that's actually that's deliberative. But I think that's unusual. I'm an academic. I like that kind of conversation, so I tune into it. That I don't think that is necessarily the case with most people. So let's assume that this social media is, by its very nature, undeliberative, relatively undeliberative. It's not that it can't be deliberative. I think I've just given you some examples where it could be, but the clickbait, the what goes viral, is almost by definition relatively undeliberative. It's relatively visceral. It's relatively short. Look at the fact that in Twitter you can't use more than a certain number of words. You just can't deliberate with the number of words you got in Twitter. It's impossible. So there's much about social media that's anti-deliberative. So what do we do? I think basically here again, I just have to appeal to particularly young people to use your ingenuity. Human beings are extremely ingenious people. We can think. We can sometimes figure out ways. I just posed it a couple of questions ago, posed the problem of the fact that we haven't figured out ways of conveying the messages of citizens who come out of a deliberative assembly, who have been deliberating, conveying that to the public. Well, young people, figure out a way. What should we do? How should we get those things onto social media? Should people come out and take off all their clothes? What would draw the attention of a social media public to what is otherwise a relatively boring enterprise of people talking back and forth and somewhat changing their minds and coming to understand each other's positions? That's just not clickbait. But that doesn't mean to say that an ingenious person couldn't figure out some ways of making something like that go viral. I don't know how, but I'm not young enough to come up with those new ideas. But there's got to be people listening here today who are. And if we pose that as the question and we ask people, come on, think of a way. This is bad news. We've got all this social media on the visceral level. How can we make it more deliberative? And turn it over to some people, the younger people who understand it a little bit better, and pose that as the question. So I think we have to work really hard to balance those undeliberative, even anti-deliberative social media with other mechanisms that don't at the moment exist. But let's invent them. That's the possible optimism. I do have a great deal of faith in human ingenuity. I've seen it at work, so we'll see what happens. But I agree, it's a really important problem.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jane.
Thank you, Professor Mansbridge.
Moltes
Ara,
gràcies.
l'última pregunta, que anirà a càrrec de la
Last
honorable
question
consellera doctora Tània Verge
will be
Mestre.
from
Ella és
Dr.
consellera del
Tania
Departament
Verge
d'Igualtat i
Mestre.
Feminismes i
She's
catedràtica de
Counselor
Ciència
of
Política de la Universitat
Equality
Pompeu
and
Fabra.
Feminism
A
and
més,
also
és
professor at the
referent,
University
en
Pompeu
aquesta
Fabra.
triple també
And she's
mirada,
also
des
a
de,
great reference for us,
des de l'administració pública, però també des de
also in the
l'acadèmia i
government
també
and
des dels
also
moviments
in the
feministes.
academic
Endavant,
world.
consellera
So there
Verge.
you go, you have the floor.
Moltes gràcies, agraeixo al Colpis i al
Thank you very
Consell Nacional
much.
de
Thank you,
Dones Catalonia
Colpis
l'oportunitat de participar
and
en
the
aquest acte i
Women
de
Group
poder
of
preguntar
Catalonia,
directament
the
a la
opportunity to
professora Jane
allow me to be
Mansbridge
here today. And I would also
algunes reflexions que
like to
han inspirat
thank
també el meu treball.
you
És un
for
referent
letting me
personal i
ask
acadèmic.
Jane
Després, en la part
Mansbridge,
de
such
conclusions,
an important
m'hi
part
estendré.
of all of
Tenim
my
un debat
studies
recurrent,
and
a
career
vegades més acadèmic, a vegades de
to
tipus
ask
més
questions. So
social. Quan dic social, vull
sometimes
dir
we
fins
have
i tot de
some
conversa
social
col·loquial
questions,
al carrer, de quines
like
característiques
questions
haurien de
that
tenir els i
we
les
could
representants
ask
polítiques,
in the
no? Què
street.
fa
So what
que
are the
una persona sigui
characteristics, for
considerada una
example,
bona
of
representant
a
política?
good
I
political
tenim
representative?
sovint aquesta tensió
And we
entre
often
aquells
have
criteris
this
que es
tension
defineixen
among the different criteria
pensant
that are
des de
defined
l'àmbit empíric allò que
regarding
podem
the
mesurar,
empirical
no? Que tinguin estudis
miserable
acadèmics, que
way
tinguin
that they have
experiència en la
academical
política, que
studies or
tinguin
previous
capacitat
experience
oratòria,
in
que poden
politics
arribar a
or
ser molt excloents, molt
public
elitistes,
speaking
o d'altres
knowledge,
que es
maybe
basen
more like
simplement en prejudicis, en estereotips,
prejudices or
si oferíssim,
stereotypes.
si oferíssim a diverses persones
If
qui
we
seria millor
could
representant,
offer
si un empresari
this
o
question,
una
who could
educadora
represent you
social,
better?
molta gent atribuiria
A
més capacitat
businessman
d'actuar
or a
a
social
l'empresari que a
educator?
l'educadora
A lot of
social, quan
people
la
would
segona
give
tindria molta més
the
experiència
opportunity
i
to a
coneixement en la
businessman.
pràctica de polítiques
However,
públiques en l'àmbit
this
de
second
l'educació, dels serveis
person
socials,
would
no?
have much more or
Per
be a
tant,
broader
arrosseguem
knowledge
tota una
of the
sèrie
social
d'estereotips en
services
les
that we
valoracions
have,
i això també
etc.
té
So
una traducció
sometimes
acadèmica. La
our thoughts
professora
are linked to
Mansbridge
stereotypes.
va ser una de les primeres que va recuperar aquest
That's why
concepte de
Professor
representació
Mansbridge
descriptiva, de
recovered
quines
this
característiques tenen els
descriptive
representants i com
of
afecta
these
això a les altres
representatives and
dimensions
how
de la
all of this affects
representació,
the different
una
dimensions
dimensió
of
que
the
havia estat
representation.
descartada
This was
per
a
les teories
dimension
clàssiques de
that was
representació política per considerar-se passives,
discarded
perquè total
before
sobre la
because they thought
representació
this was
descriptiva
passive,
no hi pots
because
fer
of
res,
course
perquè tu
you
no
can't
tries
do
ser com ets,
anything about
simplement
the
ets d'una
passive
determinada manera
description. You can't
i
do
a més
anything or
del
you
com
can't
ets
change who you
no
are
se'n deriven necessàriament no, la
because
política de les idees o és més difícil fer retiment de comptes
none
sobre
of
com és
these
una persona que no sobre el
ideals
que
or
fa.
politics
I
come
un dels
from who
articles
you are.
que trenca
One of
aquesta
the
conversa, trencant el
articles that
sentit, que la
break,
posa sobre la
or
taula
the reports
per
that break
reflexionar amb un canvi de la pregunta, que és
these
pensem
ideas
com hauria de ser la
is the
representació i
following
en funció de
question.
quina representació considerem
Let's
millor,
think, let's
aleshores
ask ourselves
definirem
how
les característiques dels
this
representants o podrem
representation
pensar des d'un altre
is
lloc
done.
com han de ser aquests
And this
representants.
way we can
Aquest
ask how these
article
representatives
de l'any 99 sobre representació descriptiva,
have to be.
professora
So
Mansbridge donava
Professor
sí
Mansbridge, you
contingent
used to give,
perquè
you gave a
les
yes,
persones
a clear
negres haurien
yes
de representar les persones negres i les
on
dones
why
haurien de
Black
representar les
people
dones i la
and
pregunta que li faig
women
és si
should
dues
be
dècades després
represented.
aquest article
This was
continua
2 decades
reflexionant
ago. Right now, do you still
manera i
think
quina
the
és la
same way?
rellevància de la representació
And
descriptiva
how do you think
per la
this
democràcia
descriptive
deliberativa.
relevance
Moltes gràcies.
is applicable to today's needs? Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. That particular article will be in the second volume of this series, the one on feminism and power. So I'll talk about it a little bit for people who don't know it. But before I do, I'll just say you're being here. Your being here as a representative is critical for many of the reasons that I expressed in that article. First of all, you're asking great questions that not necessarily a man would have asked. Secondly, you're feeling those questions. If we had more chance, if we were together, over lunch, or if we had a little bit more chance for back and forth, I would be able to I would be able to ask you more questions. You'd be able to ask me more questions, and we would draw on a shared experience. You share experience, even though you're probably from a professional class. I don't know, but even if you weren't, you're now in a professional class. But you've got shared experiences even with the poorest of women in Catalonia. And you've heard even experiences that you haven't shared yourself personally, you heard in the course of your life, you've been much closer to, so that you can represent them and you can ask me questions that are more pointed. Just the way you phrase the question comes from your own experience. So I think we have to recognize that when I talk about the representative system, I talk not only about elected representatives, but representatives in the societal arena. So you are representing women in the societal arena. You're a formal representative, and you're also an informal representative in various ways. But in this particular moment, you're a formal representative. It's just a formal representative in the part of the system that's the societal part. And I think we have to always really understand how important it is to look beyond just the elected representatives to that whole larger representative system, and try to make sure that we've got appropriate descriptive representation in all of those realms. So that's just first. But thank you. I think the issue is as important today as when I wrote that article a couple of decades ago. Incidentally, there will be in politics, the journal Politics and Gender is just going to come out in the next couple of months, I think, with a symposium, sort of rethinking of it and asking me what I thought. So anybody really interested can read them. But yes, I think descriptive representation is even more important today than when I wrote then, for several reasons. So I just want to look at two of the contingencies that I argued then made descriptive representation more valuable. Because I was arguing that descriptive representation is more valuable in some contexts than others. It's not just that it's, we need it, and that's the end of that. We need it specifically in certain contexts. And one context is the need for good communication between representatives and constituents, and the other has to do with interests that I called uncrystallized interests that aren't on the political table, but that might actually come up in the course of legislation. And because representatives haven't run for office on it, they don't necessarily know what their constituents think about it. There are many times in which a representative has to draw on that representative's own experience. And if you don't have, women there, you're not going to have much women's experience drawn upon. So I want those two things, communication and uncrystallized interests. First, communication. I think that mutual communication between constituents and representatives is even more important now than when I wrote, because legitimacy created the point that I made a minute ago, that because legitimacy is declining, that communication has to be stronger. It's true not just for women and Blacks, but also by class. Labor unions have declined tremendously as a vehicle for conveying popular sentiment to the legislative and administrative arenas. There are not as many people coming up through the unions and becoming representatives themselves. So that's inequality has soared, so that there are these vast communicative gaps between those with power and those without. Populism, both left and right, arises, in my view, in part because many people feel rightly that they've not been heard, and that leaves a great space for both the good and for the bad, to jump in and say, I have heard you. But rather than just a great leader saying, I have heard you, I think that recursive communication, going back and forth between representative and constituent, is better. What facilitates recursive communication? Some feeling of that I can be understood. You speak with the same accent that I do. That you when I mention an experience, you jump on it and say, yes, that happened to me too, or you don't have to be so quite blunt about it. There's all sorts of ways that you can convey shared experience if you come from a group, and that really facilitates communication. I don't know if I have time to mention it, but a friend of mine just was on a bus taking her students around at Harvard around to different towns. She's doing budgets. The mayor of a town right outside Boston, Revere, got on the bus and started talking. And he talked with a deep Revere accent, a deep working class Boston accent. And the bus driver started listening. And she noticed that the bus driver was listening to this guy because he was speaking the same language, so to speak. He was speaking with the Boston accent that bus driver himself had. So there was immediate sense of, oh, this guy probably understands me. So I think that kind of recursive communication, this back and forth, mutually responsive communication, works better with descriptive representatives because they have the shared experiences with the constituents they represent. They're of the group, not just for the group. So that shared experience, I think, is quite crucial to communication. And as legitimacy becomes more important, that becomes more important. And second, uncrystallized interests. If you're of a group, if you come from that group's shared experiences, you can put issues on the table that are important to that group. And just recently in the symposium I read about, one of the women writing pointed out that the Congressional Caucus on Black maternal health did not come about until there was a critical mass of Black women representatives. As it happens, Black women have different health problems, not completely different health problems, but a set of different health problems from white women and obviously from Black men and white men. But there had never been anybody paying any particular attention to these issues until this critical mass of Black women legislators got together, talked, what I call enclave deliberation, talked among themselves and said, we have to establish a Black maternal health caucus. And we've got to work on Black maternal health legislation. So that's an example of uncrystallized issues. And I think that there probably are many uncrystallized issues in these left behind economic areas where who don't have descriptive representatives usually in legislatures. They might have somebody from that area, but not necessarily a farmer or a miner or whatever it might be. So in the negotiations that take place and thinking about the problem, you often can't just give people exactly what they want. It's too expensive, or it contradicts other values, but if you can talk and listen actively, you can try to find out, okay, they're asking for X. What do they want underneath? And if I can find out what they want underneath and find another way of giving them what they want at lower cost and lower cost in other values. It doesn't necessarily have to be lower cost in money, but lower cost in freedom, lower cost in X, lower cost in Y. If I can figure out how to give them what they need, then we're in much better shape. But it's very hard to figure out what somebody needs if you're talking with somebody who's not really from that population. Representing them for sure and can be as absolutely honest and decent and good and trying very hard to represent them. But if they haven't lived it, it's hard for them to know what to give away, how to act, what would be not just acceptable, but maybe even welcomed as an alternative. It's not that easy. So these uncrystallized interests are also extremely important. And I think political scientists just haven't paid enough attention to the work of negotiation or passed on to legislators the lessons, the 40 years of lessons in negotiation that we've learned in the business world. But a lot of those lessons focus on this issue of finding the interests underneath positions. So this is all by way of saying that as our problems become more difficult to solve, and I think they are becoming more difficult to solve, having descriptive representatives there who are able to think like their constituents in a deep way, as well as just represent what they possibly can of them, that's going to be extremely important. One contingency I didn't mention in the article, and I've only thought of recently in the last several days, is that when the skills and interests I talked earlier about how we need all of our skills and all of our interests to solve problems. When some particular skills and interests of a particular group of people is not being drawn upon very much because they're not in the representative classes, we're losing those skills and interests. And I think of the current war in Ukraine. For various reasons, both in the past and the present, women tend to be more pro-peace than men. But research also shows that women have a more participatory leadership styles, probably because we've not been close to the centers of power. We don't expect to be close to the centers of power. So we've learned various ways of listening harder, paying more attention, leading in a more participatory way. And that's the research shows that's more true of women than men, these participatory leadership styles. Well, what would have happened if we'd had more negotiators on both sides who were women? Maybe nothing. Maybe would more participatory styles have helped? Maybe not. We really don't know. We don't have the counterfactual. But we do know that women are deeply underrepresented in those negotiations, and that whatever skills, such as a more participatory approach that they might have from the socialization, were not being utilized. So I think drawing on all the skills we possibly can is extremely important. And that's a point. The skills utilization point was not a point I made in that article, but it's one that I've thought of since, and where I think the representation is important, along with communication and uncrystallized interests. So I still think it's important, and I think it's even more important. Thank you.
Brilliant, Professor Mansbridge. I ara donem per tancat el col·loqui.
Thank you very much. So with this, we've finished the debate, and we would like to ask you to say a few words to finish the event. I don't know if you want to say something, Professor Mansbridge.
Sure. I realize we're rather close to the end of the event, so I'll take just a minute or two to signal again that point I made in response to the question on globalization, that we need to create more free use goods. We need to have more, unfortunately, we're going to need more government coercion. We're going to need more legitimacy for our governments. We are going to, I'll skip some examples since we're so close to the end, but that coercion has to be more normatively legitimate, both to be effective and to be moral. So we need to innovate. We need to innovate in our institutions. We need to innovate in our democratic theory that guides our institutions. And so we have to attend to what human beings are already doing, because as I say, we're learning machines, we're inventive. There's a lot of people doing things for which there is no theory. The theory is implicit. They're doing it because it seems to work. And they're trying to make things work, trying to make things work. So one job is to try to figure out, okay, what are they doing? What are the ideas that actually are behind what they're doing? And we distill those ideas and then share them with other people. Let's pay attention to what human beings are already, that amazing inventiveness that we're already doing. As we experiment, as we learn by trial and error, let's watch ourselves and let's see what we're doing, and let's try to distill it and pass it on to others. So that's the kind of theory, democratic theory I do. It's inductive, it's based in practice, but it's a matter of distilling. And I believe the theory we need most now is problem-driven. It must respond to our needs that as we're growing more interdependent every day. And so that kind of theory, I think, can help us develop better institutions and help us understand our own democratic impulses better. So that's the kind of theory I do. I think it may well attend to contingency. I think it will have to encompass both conflict and commonality. And to succeed, it will combine hope, the hope that you, Lydia, and that everyone here under 40 has in their DNA. You can't be young without having hope. And that even some of us over 80 still have a little bit of that hope. It has to combine that hope with fear, because both hope and fear are appropriate responses to the challenges we face today. Thank you.
Resposta als
Thank you,
reptes que
Professor,
ens enfrontem
for
avui en
all
dia.
your
Moltes gràcies,
reflection and
professora,
wishes
per
for
la
the
seva
present and
contribució i
future.
per la seva
Per
participació en el
acabar,
debat.
la
finish
concloenda
with,
anirà a càrrec de la
I'll give
honorable
the floor
consellera Tania Verge.
to Tania
Endavant,
Verge,
consellera.
the Counselor of
Moltes gràcies
Equality
de
and
nou.
Feminism.
Com he
Thank you
dit
very
abans,
much
la
again.
professora Jane Mansbridge és un
As I
referent
was
acadèmic i
saying,
personal.
Dr. Mansbridge is
A
such
nivell
a
acadèmic,
professional and
sabem
personal
que
reference.
la inclusió de la perspectiva de
In
gènere
the
en
academia,
els
we
estudis
know
acadèmics
that
i
it's important to
crec
include this
a la
gender
ciència
perspective
política no ha
and
sigut
political
fàcil.
science, and we know that
S'ha
this has not
percebut
been
durant molt de
difficult.
temps
It has
com que
been
els
very
temes que tenien a veure
controversial,
amb les dones, o sigui,
and
diem,
many people have thought
persones
that
racialitzades o amb altres
that
col·lectius
these topics that had to do
històricament
with
marginats
women or
eren
Black
temes
people were
secundaris,
topics that
temes
were not that
menors, temes que en
important,
tot
were
cas no formaven part del nucli dur
something that
del cor
didn't
de la
belong to
ciència
the
política.
core of political
En canvi,
science.
llegim tots
But
aquests textos, tant
we
els
now
més
read
pioners com
the
els més
articles
recents,
of
i
Dr.
estem parlant
Mansbridge,
de qüestions
and
fonamentals de la ciència
we see
política.
that these are vital topics for
del
social science,
poder, de
for
la
politics.
representació,
We're talking about power,
de la ciutadania, de
representation,
la participació.
citizenship.
Estem parlant
We
dels
talk
elements
about
centrals. Si la ciència política no
core
parla d'això, de què
concepts of
parla?
political
I, per tant,
science,
la
right?
ciència política
So
feminista, al capdavall, és una bona ciència
feminism
política. El que fa és
belongs
corregir
to social
biaixos,
sciences and
corregir
belongs to politics as well.
avaluacions
And
tant
with that,
teòriques com
we
empíriques
correct
que han estat parcials, que han
correct
perdut una
partial
part de la
theoric
mirada per no haver
frameworks that
incorporat
didn't
a
include
les
this
dones com a
perspective,
construcció
right,
social,
in the
o
past,
per haver pensat
that didn't
teories
include
que busquen com resoldre
this
les
gender
desigualtats
perspective.
sense haver tingut en compte
Because
en el
sometimes
plantejament
we
de
try
les
to
teories que hi ha
solve
unes desigualtats que
inequality
potser cal
without having
resoldre
this
primer
perspective
abans
into
de
account,
plantejar
right?
la teoria. I tenim múltiples exemples, des
And
de
we
com
have
ens
many
canviaria
examples.
com calendaritzem l'edat de les democràcies, perquè
How we
seguim
talk about
plantejant la
democracy,
història de les
how we
democràcies
talk about history of democracy,
com a governs representatius, però especialment quan
we
s'adopta
talk
el
about
sufragi masculí.
representative
Sabem que, com a mínim, com a tota
democracy,
la població encara
democracies
exclosa,
in the past,
canviaria
but we
també
knew
la
that only
identificació de
men
quins són
were
els
able to
actors
vote,
claus de
for
la
example. So
democratització
we should
o els
reassess
factors
that
claus de
maybe
la
as well.
democratització. No és necessàriament el desenvolupament
And
socioeconòmic sense
how we
mobilització
talk
per
about
part
democratization,
d'organitzacions,
are we only taking into
sense
account
mobilització col·lectiva de les
socioeconomic
dones
values,
no
for
s'hagués
example? Are we
aconseguit
taking
el
into
dret a
account
vot,
women
o com pensem
participation?
també en quins drets i
So
llibertats garanteixen
we
els
should
règims
also
democràtics
talk
quan
about
el dret
the,
al propi cos,
for
sigui
example, which
l'avortament o
rights
altres drets derivats, o
are
la violència contra les
reassured
dones,
by a
que no
democracy.
tenim, per
We
tant, ni
have to
garantit
take
el
into
dret a
account
la integritat
women's rights as
física o
well.
sexual,
So our
són una
rights,
amenaça
rights
clara,
over
o
our
són
own
un
bodies,
atac
right?
frontal al que entenem per democràcies.
So
Com
we see
apuntava
that
la professora
everything's
Mansbridge també, quan pensem en la
constantly
representació i s'ha
evolving.
descartat
When we
durant
talk
tant de
about
temps l'element
representation,
descriptiu a l'hora d'identificar què és una bona representació, o què
in the
facilitaria
past,
que hi hagués una bona representació perquè tots els
we
interessos
talked
hi
about
fossin presents
how
o perquè
democracy
poguessin
or how
emergir aquests
representation
interessos.
would be
Aquí,
ideal,
professora
right?
Mansbridge, m'ha
How
vingut al cap
we can
l'any 2009
really
el
take into
Parlament de
account
Catalunya va
everyone's
celebrar
interests.
el Parlament de les
In
Dones, o el ple de les
2009,
dones.
our
Aquí la paraula
parliament in
ple té un doble
Catalonia, we
significat perquè ple
celebrated
volia dir
women's
una
parliament,
sessió plenària
and
realitzada al mateix hemicicle
we
on tenen lloc normalment
celebrated
les
a
sessions del
session
Parlament,
in
on
parliament
hi havia
dedicated to
representació
women,
tant de les
where
diputades,
we
només
had a
les dones diputades,
representation
i
from
també
the members of the
representants de la
assemblies, but
societat
also
civil, del moviment
representatives from
feminista,
civil
un
movements,
treball que s'havia fet
feminist civil
entre la
movements
institució
in
i el
Catalonia.
Consell Nacional de
So
Dones de Catalunya per elaborar
we
aquest ple. Per tant, era una sessió
we
plenària
elaborated and organized a
sobre els drets de
celebration
les
in
dones, però al
this
mateix temps
assembly
era un hemicicle
to
ple de dones, perquè
celebrate
només hi havia
women's rights,
representació
also
descriptiva a la seva
represented
màxima
by
potència.
women,
En
right?
aquest sentit,
So
perquè
it was
estàvem
great.
sobrerepresentades, però va permetre, per exemple,
And
aprovar una declaració
we
que,
approved
evidentment, tenia un
a
component simbòlic,
declaration
perquè
that it
les
was, of
declaracions
course,
que aprova
symbolic, of
el
course,
Parlament, si no són per part de
because it
representants
was
electes, doncs no tenen la
not
força
legally binding,
suficient, però aquesta
but
declaració
still, this
se la va fer
declaration
seva
was
al Parlament i la
important
va aprovar en
and
una
was
sessió
approved
ordinària
by the
sense
Parliament in an
modificar
extraordinary
absolutament
session.
cap coma. Per tant, el treball que havien fet
And so
diputades i
we put into the
representants
spotlight
d'entitats socials
how
era en si un
much
procés
work we
deliberatiu que
did
permetia
in a
transformar també
deliberative
com es fa política,
process, right?
o part de com es fa aquesta política. També trencava imaginaris de qui són els cossos
We
legítims
also
per representar no? O com es realitza
rogue
aquesta
stereotypes regarding
representació
politics
i
and
va
women.
permetre també aflorar temes. Per
And
exemple, en
we
aquella
tackled topics
declaració es parla per primera vegada de la violència contra les dones en
such as
política.
violence
I uns mesos
against
més tard, el
political
Parlament
against
revisava
women
la llei contra la
which
violència
work in
masclista o la
politics,
violència de gènere i incorporava la violència contra les dones en
which is
política
very
com una forma
specific, but
específica
it's
de
a new
violència
form
de
of
gènere.
violence also against women.
Apuntava també a la professora
What
Mansbridge
else?
com un referent
So,
personal i aquí Felipe
Dr.
Rey també
Mansbridge
ho
is also
subratlla en un dels capítols
a
del
very
llibre quan
important
presenta l'obra
personal reference for me as
de la
well,
professora Mansbridge com una filosofia política personal i diu
because
també
her
algunos de sus
philosophy is
escritos
also
son
very
semblantes de sus
personal,
compañeras de lucha, la mira
and
solidaria
your
e intelectual.
contribution
I aquí
has
crec que també val
meant
la
something
pena
very important for us,
remarcar
for women, because you've
què
been
aporta la ciència
such a
política
reference
feminista,
and
perquè
like a
també
friend
és
for
un
us, so to
posicionament
say.
polític, no? Té a
And
veure amb posar els propis coneixements, la
this is what
recerca, al servei d'un projecte de
political
transformació
science is
social,
about,
d'un
right? To
projecte
put your
feminista que
own
busca transformar
knowledge
aquestes
and
relacions
your
desiguals de
commitment
gènere
to
que segueixen
the
travessant tots els
evolvement
àmbits de la
and
societat,
the
incloent també
development of
l'acadèmia.
democracy
I des
and
d'aquesta
social
definició
sciences.
àmplia de la política que ve del
This is
feminisme, allò
what politics is
personal
about at the
és
end of the day.
polític, situant les relacions de poder al centre de la recerca i considerant imprescindible el
So,
compromís amb l'erradicació de la desigualtat i la
we believe
injustícia.
that commitment against
Així doncs,
inequality
per cloure,
is vital, as you've said,
Professor Mansbridge,
and we very much value your contribution.
to act that has guided many of us. Ha sigut inspirador que hi hagués aquestes politòlogues que
It's
obrissin
been
camí, que ens posessin molt
inspiring
més
for
fàcil a
us
les
to
que
have
vingut
your
després,
figure
perquè ja teníem aquests
to
referents
open a
i
way
que ens permet
to
també
the
ara seguir
future, to
transmetent a
politics,
les noves
so
generacions
that
de
we can also
politòlegs i
convey your
politòlogues
messages to the new
que la història
generations,
de la ciència política és
to
un
talk about
compromís amb la
history
lluita per
of
la
political
democràcia i un
science with
compromís amb
figures
l'erradicació de la
as
desigualtat
yours.
i que no podem ser en cap cas torres d'ivori, no? Que la nostra recerca ha
And
de poder també
your
transformar
research will
totes
indeed
aquestes
make a difference
desigualtats i injustícies
and
socials.
will create a
Moltes gràcies
change.
també al
Also, thank
Colloquium
you very
i
much to
novament al
Colloquium
Consell Nacional de Dones de Catalunya per
and
l'organització
to the National
d'aquest acte.
Council
Ha
of
estat un
Women
plaer
in
poder-lo
Catalonia. It
compartir amb
has been a
vosaltres.
pleasure to have taken part in this debate today with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very, very much. This has been an extraordinary moment. I appreciate it greatly. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Moltes gràcies a tots els
Thank you very much
participants,
to all
amigues
participants,
i amics. A partir d'ara, esperem,
of you.
senyora
Thank
Mansbridge, que
you,
ens
dear
pugui
friends. I hope that
acompanyar amb
Dr.
el futur
Mansbridge
volum
can
que està per publicar de Feminisme i Poder.
also be here,
Igualment,
maybe
així
next time, to present the new volume.
us oferim casa nostra, que és casa
You are
vostra,
very
el Col·legi
welcome
de Ciència Política
here
i Sociologia de Catalunya,
the
per tal de poder
Professional
fer
College of
difusió
Political Science,
de l'obra
Scientists and
i
Sociologists of
de tots
Barcelona,
els canvis que s'han de produir
to talk about
en
lo continu, per tal
democracy,
de
about
transformar la nostra
participation, about
societat
the
i
future,
fer-la
to be able
molt més
to make
democràtica,
our
plural i igual.
society a better place.